looking forward to the conversation. So maybe just, I think this is a pretty sophisticated audience, but nevertheless, maybe just a little bit of an introduction to the International Secretariat, and we'll go from there.
Sure thing. Yeah, and hopefully we won't have any comedy moments where I fall off what feels a bit like a bedside table. But I'm very short, so at least this means you can see me. So my name's Helwen Philpott, as Sarah said. I'm the head of the International Pandemic Preparedness Secretariat. Before that, my background has been working in national government in the UK Department of Health and Cabinet Office, previously running the G7 and G20 team there. So for me, this role is a really exciting opportunity to combine my nerdy global health background with ways of kind of maintaining political will and momentum through multilateral fora. So the IPPPS is an overly grand name for what is a very small team of us who have been set up as a time-limited entity to support the implementation of the 100-day mission. When the G7 endorsed the 100-day mission in 2021, which is to try and have vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics ready within 100 days of a future pandemic, G7 chief scientific advisors wrote an initial report setting out 25 recommendations and a proposed delivery framework for those recommendations. And as part of that, they thought it would be incredibly helpful to have a small time-limited team to maintain accountability and continuity on some of the concrete actions in there. Because as we know, the G7 and G20 can be brilliant at many things, but following through and accountability hasn't always been its strong suit. So very honoured to be working on this important mission. And it's incredibly exciting for lots of reasons, which we can get into. Over to you.
Thanks. But by the way, I'll start off with some questions, but if you want this to be really interesting, you'll need to come in actually, and so be thinking now with your questions. We would like audience participation for this. So, I just came from another session and with different groups talking about pandemic preparedness. And of course, each group, depending on what their particular focus was, people said we have to have genomic surveillance and we have to have better data and we have to have digital health and many things. So where do you start? Where are the priorities for the Secretariat of all the different things that need to be done to make pandemic preparedness work?
It's a really good point. And I should say, I think for us, we're primarily focused, we recognize there is a much broader ecosystem, and there are an awful lot of really critical enablers, like surveillance, like good governance, like finance, but we're particularly focused on the development of medical countermeasures and those vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. Because as we know, the first 100 days of a pandemic is so critical for changing the course of the rest of it. If you look at the graph of deaths and cases, if we'd had vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics much earlier than we did, we could have completely changed the curve. And I should say that when we talk about the 100-day mission, what we're talking about is from day zero, which is currently the only real concrete trigger we have is a fake, but we recognize in many ways that's too late. You need to start planning this much earlier, but we kind of need that academic work to agree what those criteria are to define a slightly earlier trigger. And I know those conversations are going on as part of the IHR regulation review and the medical countermeasures platform. But we're talking about that day 0 to day 100, having products ready to scale up, approved and ready to scale up. But in recognition that there is a vast other body of work in the second 100 days to get those products manufactured at scale and delivered across the world. But there are things that you need to be doing in the first 100 days in parallel to be ready for that mass scale up. And we might come on to that later. So I think for me, one of the things is thinking about what are the baseline blocks of preparedness that we want to have in place to be ready next time. And there's a lot of conversations around surge financing at the moment. And the calculations that you make about the kind of surge financing that you need and the volume of surge financing that you need depend on the level of preparedness that you have in advance. And as was said in a conversation yesterday, preparedness is never going to stop the need for response financing, but it can reduce it, and it can change the type of financing that you need. So in my mind, what we really want to work towards in the 100-day mission is having prototype libraries of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics that will allow us to have the R&D building blocks to pivot that to really specific targeted tools if we're in a disease X scenario where we don't quite know what the pathogen is that we're dealing with.
So I'll come back to the financing in just a minute, but before I do that, I want to dig into a little bit of this day 0 concept, right? And so there's a lot of discussions about the fake designation, right? The public health emergency of international concern and how fit for purpose that may be. but is, things don't start as a fake. Even if they become one, they start as small things that then get bigger. So how do we really calculate? Well, of course, we wouldn't really like to start, I think, with the 100 days mission. We've talked about it fine. Really, it's the marathon before the sprint. But even with the sprint, I think we'd like to not start that with a fake, right? We'd like to have, day zero be something earlier on. But how do we put the surveillance in place and calculate day zero when there's something that we need to react to?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So obviously, as surveillance is our baseline, and talking about those baseline building blocks, strong surveillance systems, strong primary care systems, because as we know, the best surveillance is people, and people that know how to read the data and know how to read the patients and the signs that they're seeing. So having those two building blocks of strong primary care and strong surveillance systems. And ideally, as you say, we never get to the fake. When we talk about the 100 days being related to pandemic preparedness, it is. But ideally, in many ways, we never get to another pandemic. We get so good at responding rapidly to outbreaks that we can get on top of them, and they never balloon out of control. So I think there's multiple levels. Part of it is making diagnostic use normalized in primary care and point of care settings and non-clinical settings so that we've got more of that data. And then doing what we can to build up the digital capability in a lot of systems so that we can start rolling out and using some of the exciting multiplex tools that you guys are working on and that we're seeing coming through. And that feeds up to some form of decision making. And that's the criticality, I think, having good governance and good decision making that allows us to know when to roll out the rapid response teams, or start that process of developing medical countermeasures if we don't have them already for tackling it.
And speaking of the diagnostic tools, don't miss the opportunity to come see all the toys here a little bit later on. So it's really quite exciting when you see what's out there now. A very broad question. How do you? It's what I think 2 years or so on now for the 100 days mission, and how's it going? I mean, are we there yet? How many days have we cut off basically so far?
It may not shock you to realise that we're not quite there yet, but there are some really exciting things. The fact that with the Uganda Ebola Sudan response, we saw that there was product in country within 79 days. Is a huge step forward, and thanks to the hard work of the Ugandan government and WHO and many others, the outbreak was coming under control by that point, so it could be used for safety testing, but not necessarily efficacy data at that point. But the ideal would be to have accelerated manufacturing processes that hadn't taken 79 days to do the fill and finish, that you had kind of doses ready that were sufficient for a clinical trial at least, so you could get the product to country to do trials much more rapidly. And so that's one of the things that our science and technology expert group is doing. We have a 100-day mission science and technology expert group, which is 20 experts that span vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, manufacturing, clinical trials, everything that's needed to make the 100-day mission a reality, and they organize themselves into subgroups focusing on different elements, one of which is diagnostics, but one of which is on manufacturing, and they're looking at everything that was relatively exceptional about that Ebola Sudan response, and how we could normalize that. And one of our taglines in the 100-day mission is making the exceptional routine. And I think that is one of the exciting things that we are seeing. There was exceptional collaboration and exceptional innovation during COVID, but there were also things that we didn't quite get right on the access and equity side of things. And I think we are seeing people starting to implement and think about ways of doing things differently in terms of making that exceptional routine. Regulation is one of those areas where there's a lot that can be done to adopt some of those exceptional practices and make them routine. There's still a way to go, but those are some of the conversations that I think are most exciting that will enable us to speed up our response using things like platform data, drug master files, so that regulators have more information about products on day zero so that they don't have to start asking questions from scratch.
Yeah, thanks for that. You mentioned manufacturing, and FIND has been promoting and very engaged in promoting regional manufacturing. You'll hear more about that, I think, in today's session. But really, I think one of the challenges, it's one thing to create that capacity to manufacture something, and I think that's important. We probably would all agree on that. But really, the harder part, perhaps, is the downstream, right? And so you can produce a test, a diagnostic test, but of course, that has to be financially viable, right? Someone has to say, okay, we want this test, and we'll use this test. And so, these are not all philanthropic efforts of people producing things just for public good. Most of them have a bottom line that need to make some money or at least stay viable. How do you view that? How's the approach to that to make this system, even if we have the capacity to make it viable in the longer term?
Yeah, exactly. The questions of economic sustainability are really critical in all of this. And the heartening thing is that people are having these conversations and trying to think about it. It then needs to be joined up with the political will and some of the economic realities. But I think people talk about cycles of panic and neglect. And I think one of the ways to get over the cycles of panic and neglect are to bring together the universal health coverage and the pandemic preparedness conversations, as we're starting to see happen this week. Has been involved in lots of conversations where we're seeing that. And having the building blocks for pandemic preparedness built into universal health coverage is the best way to maintain sustainable markets for these things, I think. If you have it as a requirement of part of your universal health coverage plan that you will be using diagnostics regularly at point of care, it builds the market to keep companies in this space, even if they might not be producing pandemic diagnostics during inter-pandemic times, they can pivot and there's the market there to do that. The same on workforce, the same on things like clinical trial infrastructures for other products like vaccines and therapeutics, having clinical trial infrastructures there as part of a universal health coverage system. All these things are critical to having standing capacity, regulators that have mutual recognition and harmonization, building in these building blocks of preparedness as part of universal health coverage to make it that sustainable routine that it doesn't feel like an exceptional ask to a health minister to invest in these things. You can make the case about how it will benefit their citizens every day of the year, regardless of whether there's an outbreak or not.
And the so fine, we see ourselves as one of the principal players in that diagnostic development and end-to-end diagnostics and for the 100 Days mission. How can I put this diplomatically? There's not been a huge enthusiastic influx of resources to finance that. We still have things that we are doing from COVID, of course, and this is really our day-to-day work, whether you call it the 100 Days mission or not. But nevertheless, how do we finance this? Because obviously it takes resources to do this and develop the tools. We have many good tools these days, but it takes a lot more to actually make sure that they're put in the right hands to get the actionable evidence that people can use both on a patient care level and a surveillance level. Any thoughts on that? You mentioned it earlier, but the financing challenge?
Yeah, it's a really good one. And Daniel hasn't actually asked me to say this, but FIND have a brilliant 100-day mission roadmap of how to actually make it work from day 0 to day 100 for diagnostics to get those prototype libraries of diagnostics for the top 10 pathogens. Because currently we actually only have 4 of the WHO R&D pathogens that have approved rapid diagnostic tests. There are many others that still don't. And that's kind of scary if we have an outbreak of Marburg or Nipah or Rift, although there are lab tests for that. But FIND has a brilliant plan, and actually costing it out, it would only be 80 million over 4 years to finance that plan. And in the grand scheme of things, that's relatively small money for what is going to be a huge return on investment. So one of the things I'm doing is in conversations with G7 and G20, shouting about that and making clear that diagnostics have to be the first line of defense in any outbreak or any pandemic. It really is the best value for money you could have. And it's frustrating that I no longer have my direct line to UK government leadership. But when I eventually get back there, I will continue to be banging this drum. If we do have any funders in the room and you've got some money in your pockets, put it into FIND, put it into diagnostics. It really is the best value for money you'll get. So I think it's continuing to make that case about value for money, continuing to show the trajectory change to outbreaks and pandemics when we're able to roll out diagnostics in the early days. Like, the facts are on your side. We need to make more noise about it. And it is difficult because I think diagnostics and therapeutics to an extent are often the sort of the younger siblings to vaccines maybe, which are seen as a slightly more sexy silver bullet. But that's why the 100-Day mission puts a lot of emphasis on the criticality of all 3 tools together. And they work in partnership, and you can't have one without the other. So making more noise is essentially my answer.
Well, thanks for making noise, and I want to be clear that we did not discuss this before.
We really didn't.
We appreciate the kind words about FIND, but they weren't planted by me. So thank you very much for that. I want to just reiterate that welcome input from the audience. I can keep asking questions and we'll keep asking questions, but if anyone has a question, please. I think, are you, SJ, doing the mic? Or yeah, we have to. So any questions from the audience at this point? Yeah.
Hi, Sharon Ann Lynch with the O'Neill Institute at Georgetown. So what are the lessons learned so that we don't repeat the problem of WHO not recommending COVID self-tests for LMICs for so long, even though the rest of the world was certainly using them to protect their families, their communities, etc. So how do you see getting around such barriers in the future?
Yeah, it was kind of crazy that we had tests within 60 days for diagnostics, but it took 226 days, 236 days for the emergency use listing to come through for rapid diagnostic tests. And I think part of that, so the 100-day mission works in three buckets of filling the gaps in the R&D arsenal, making the exceptional routine, and agreeing the rules of the road in advance. So we're not negotiating things at the start of the next pandemic. And it's using this marathon of preparedness, as Daniel said, it's the way we talk about it, the marathon of preparedness to be ready for the sprint, to have these conversations now, working with regulators to agree regulatory pathways now with WHO and with stringent regulatory authorities that define really clear criteria for safety, effectiveness, and use cases of these tests, because it doesn't need to take that long. And I think in COVID it was because some of this stuff was novel and regulators were unsure how to deal with a device versus versus vaccines and therapeutics, and there was more pressure in some ways to get approval for vaccines and therapeutics. And I think being really clear on the importance of speed of diagnostic rollout to get a handle on an outbreak, and I think that is better understood now, and the regulators that I speak to are looking at trying to have better rapid pathways for regulatory approval for diagnostics. But that's one of the things we want to make sure is really codified and that we see being made routine for approval for RDTs in LMICs and all over the world as rapidly as possible in day-to-day as well as in pandemic times, and having particular agreements in place for how some of those approvals may be done differently in pandemic times to speed that up. So the main answer is to de-risk and demystify a lot of this stuff in inter-pandemic periods so that you have clear pre-agreed pathways so people know who to call when they've got questions, so you build those relationships. So there's more of an understanding in a community in these end-to-end development and processes for these products, thinking all the way through to end use cases and how we make sure it gets to where it really needs to.
Well, I'm Shuming at Peking University. Thank you so much for your nice talk. I have a question concerning the data sharing and information sharing across different dimensions and systems in case of emergency. So how do you envision the role to be played by FIND in centralizing these different kinds of platforms, and especially in terms of integration of different sources of information data? Thank you.
That's a really good question, and in some ways it's not for me to say what the role of FIND is in that. I think integrated surveillance is absolutely critical, as you say. I think a good step forward that we saw, the IPSN launched this weekend, and we need these networks of surveillance to have a way of sharing data. There isn't necessarily an agreed international data repository at the moment of doing it. It has to be built on trust and data agreements, I think. We also need to uphold open access data platforms like GISAID, which I know is going through some challenges at the moment, but I think we do need to maintain platforms like that so that we've got open sharing of sequences and data as much as possible, but it's done in a transparent and clear and fair way. And it is actually one of the challenges that our science and technology group is looking at. We have Dr. George Gao on our science and technology expert group, and Professor Tan from Ministry of Health in Singapore, and that's one of the tasks that they're looking at. What are the agreements that we need in place to make sure we don't get held up by data sharing in an emergency situation? I might hand it over to Daniel to say what you think the role of FIND is in data sharing.
Yeah, maybe just to add a few comments. We have a very active digital health team. I don't think our leader for that is Rigveda is here this morning, but nevertheless, that's an element that we're very aware of and very active in, and supporting, really on a local level. It's not our job necessarily, we're not WHO, it's not our job to collect surveillance data or harmonize surveillance data across countries and systems, but nevertheless on a more local level, and diagnostic network optimization and digital health is definitely something that we provide support for. I always want to put it in and provide support for, because it's not something that FIND says this is how things should be done and let's go to whatever country and implement our system. It's the opposite, right? And so working with different country partners, how do we help to optimize their system? And then obviously that's up to the Ministry of Health and the local actors, and then that system of course needs to be optimized across countries and regions, and that's really more of a WHO remit than a FIND remit. But yeah, a good question. Yeah, please.
Hi, Alex Costa, UNICEF headquarters in New York. So you were talking about Pathogen X, and we're talking about these different frameworks that are being developed after COVID. But all hypothetically, but realistically, we have a potential pandemic of H5N1 happen, if the virus accumulates enough mutations to be transmissible between humans, we can wake up tomorrow morning to an announcement there's a massive outbreak happening somewhere. So how, given all of this, how quickly are we going to be able to respond, considering we have diagnostics, we have vaccines, and we have therapeutics? But are we there already that we can scale it up very quickly, or are we actually going to spend quite some time talking about the frameworks hypothetically and trying to find the political commitments of the stakeholders?
It's a really good question, and I would love to say I think we're totally ready, we've learned all our lessons, we can respond in 100 days tomorrow, but I don't think we're there yet. I think a lot of the conversations that are being had about regional distribution of manufacturing capacity and building that regional resilience so that we don't see, you know, border restrictions stopping the supply of products and the supply of APIs and things around the world. There is a political reality that I think in another global pandemic, if it happened tomorrow, that you'd still see some of those political barriers go up. And if we don't have that regionalized distributed resilience in our manufacturing capacity, that we would still see some of the same challenges. That said, I think there have been a lot of lessons learned. And I think as actually, I was talking to Diana Twine of the Ugandan Ministry of Health the other day. She said one of the reasons they were able to respond so quickly to Ebola was because they had those networks and those relationships off the back of COVID. Poor things were only just recovering and wanted to have a bit of a rest and had to rapidly stand those back up again. What was a very tired health system, and they still responded amazingly because they had the muscle memory of responding to COVID. And I think we haven't entirely lost the muscle memory of COVID, and if we had H5N1 tomorrow, I think we would know how to stand up platforms akin to ACT-A more rapidly, hopefully learning the lessons, hopefully making sure there's more equal partnership between Global South and Global North partners. And there have been more R&D developments, and as you say, with H5N1, we have a bit more R&D in the bank to enable us to respond rapidly. So I think there frankly, I think there would still be challenges of manufacturing and distribution because we're not quite there yet. But I think in terms of the relationships and the networks, I think we could get the governance set up better. And I would actually hope we could get the financing released better because there are active conversations at the moment about which mechanisms to be drawn down more rapidly on day zero, and the recognition that if you have money 6 months down the line, it's nowhere near as good as having it 6 hours after an outbreak is declared. So some progress, it would hopefully be better than COVID, but I don't think we're fully there yet. And frankly, that is quite scary, and that's why the work that everyone in this room is doing is so critical. So let's keep at it and act as if we have to be ready tomorrow.
Yeah, great. But one comment before we go on to the next question. I think you would agree that the muscle memory is there from COVID, but it's waning, right? And so
it's tired muscle. Let's be honest.
And we see that. You know, we talked about the cycle of panic and neglect, and we see that every time, right? That okay, that's when Ebola is a huge thing in West Africa for a little while. There's a big effort on that, and then despite us saying, well, we'll never forget, we actually do forget. And so yeah, trying to act when the muscle memory is still there and make that incorporated, you know, so those muscles are sort of permanently strong is our challenge. But yeah, question.
Great. Thanks very much for the conversation so far. Yogan Pillai from the Gates Foundation. You know, one of the key challenges during COVID is certainly for low and middle income countries was getting the resources. Countries like South Africa, you know, we don't have Paxlovid right now to treat patients who are still contracting COVID. So, you know, there's a current problem. And if you look at TB, there is a current problem with PQ, you know, that we got lots and lots of new diagnostics being developed in India, for example. But the PQ process at WHO is, you know, needs to be much more rapid. So, you know, what would the Secretariat be doing, you know, on those kinds of things that are current? The related issue, of course, is we also had significant impact on routine services during the pandemic. Is the Secretariat looking at, you know, how do countries protect routine services in a pandemic? Because, you know, we're playing big time catch up at the moment with respect to TB, HIV, and the rest of it. Thanks.
Thank you, really good questions. So in terms of the remit of the Secretariat, we aren't actually, that isn't part of our mandate, looking at how to protect routine services. However, I do think part of it is thinking about, as I was saying, the enablers that you need in place so you've got the capacity and the resilience so that a pandemic wouldn't have such a vast impact on routine services, and or you've got the capacity and the resilience within the workforce and the system that you're able to catch up more quickly. As well as, I think, learning the lesson that we have to factor into response funding and response support, the need for for that rebuilding afterwards. That is part of the response, is the rebuilding and the catch-up and recognising, as Gabby's talking about at the moment, 48 million no-dose children that didn't get their routine immunisations during COVID that need to be caught up on. We need to factor that into our response. If we don't have the capacity to maintain routine services whilst responding to a pandemic, we know there's going to be a bulge that comes afterwards, and how do we set aside funding and capacity to see that as part of our response, and the job's not done until we've got back to a steady state. To your question about what we're doing on things that are happening here and now, we don't have the levers necessarily to affect immediate change in things like current access, but what we're trying to do is have conversations with WHO, with regulators, about how we can be speeding up things like PQ, and to essentially practice on speeding things up like PQ, as I was saying, now, and not waiting to a pandemic. We need to make that routine. We know it can be done more quickly when we put thought into it and we have the right people around the table. And I did hear the WHO PQ team acknowledging that needs to be done more rapidly for diagnostics the other day, and that they are wanting to work on that. In terms of the point about access, I think one of the things that we're really keen to underscore is that access has to start at the very beginning of conversations about product development and design, and having access by design built into your R&D conversations when you're having the conversations around target product profiles and use cases, making sure that's being done in consultation with affected communities, and ideally that the R&D is being done in countries where those affected communities are as well, that it's not just R&D that happens elsewhere in the world and gets transported to a country that needs it for fill and finish or final manufacturing. So I think that's one thing we're trying to do, is ensure that the access conversations start at the very beginning and are held at every stage of the value chain of developing these products, so that you don't get to a state in the end where some countries still don't have access to the basic VTDs that are needed.
Hi, my name is Jimmy Yu. I'm from Used Biotechnology from China, and we have a little device over there. So if anybody has questions about that device, I can explain later. Okay, but my question is about PQ regulatory situations, because now we have so many authorities, bodies like PQ, like European CE, like US FDA, and each state, each country has their own regulatory bodies. So as a manufacturer, the hardest part of the job for us to do is, to get the regulatory approval. So my question is there any hope we can get the harmonization of the regulatory approval? What fund is doing to promote that?
That's a really good question. I can say what we're doing, and Daniel can say what FIND is doing. I completely agree. I think this is one of the most critical parts of the value chain, where we can speed things up, where we can make things smoother. So there are various elements to this. Part of it is increasing the communication between regulators. WHO has the strategic regulatory group that meets regularly that Rogerio and Adam Hacker at CEPI bring together, and that's a first step in getting the conversations going, having the relationships between regulators. But I think there are really innovative ways that we could change the way that regulators talk to one another and can share the data that others are using. So having cloud-based platform data for products, that when FDA asks a list of questions about a particular product, it's put on this cloud-based system, and then EMA and PMDA and others can see the questions that FDA has asked and the answers that have been given, and hopefully don't have to ask those questions all over again. And there is a system like that that's being rolled out at the minute. And if we could get all regulators feeling safe and trusting of a system like that, I think that would massively help and reduce the work for companies having to submit with multiple authorities. And I think the other element is kind of just updating some of the regulatory practices. Good clinical practice is being updated at the moment in the US, as you probably know, and there'll be a public consultation coming out in a few months, and our science and technology expert group is wanting to feed into that update of good clinical practice to make sure that is taking on board the lessons from COVID of where you can actually do things slightly more efficiently by having safety data in advance, by having drug master files or product master files for products that are held by regulators, so that they have more information in advance about these products, that they don't have to ask questions from scratch. But we would love to see more mutual recognition and more regulators joining together in a group of mutual recognition, so that you can... What was that? How soon can it be? I'll ask them and feedback to you. I don't know. They're all telling me it's very difficult, but I'm banging on about it, and lots of other people are banging on about it. So I'm hoping that we'll make inch by inch progress.
You asked about fines, so I'll just add a few words, although it's not my area of expertise. We do have a small but active regulatory team who works with these issues, so we're banging on about it as well. We also meet, we're just down the hill here, and we meet with WHO PQ on a regular basis to work through some of these issues and discuss. On a broader level, one of the things that it's really kind of in its infancy is we don't see that there's really for diagnostics kind of a galvanized support network. And so one of the things we've talked about is creating a Diagnostics Alliance. And this is not a new agency or a new funding stream per se, but nevertheless galvanizing all the partners that together have a say and an interest in diagnostics. And how can we use the weight to, collectively to figure out how to have more influence and bang on it at a higher and more rapid and louder level. So that's really just in its infancy. There's a meeting that happened a few days ago to try to move that forward, but I think you'll hear more about that in the future, and we'll see if that can also have a positive influence.
Thank you. Gaurav Garg with IQVIA. So my question is to the both of you and very focused on humanitarian settings and fragile contexts. So while we're talking about the diagnostics agenda or future pandemic preparedness, how does it look for humanitarian settings and fragile country contexts, right? Because also, when you look back to the COVID experience, even in vaccine delivery, there were acute challenges, right? So I mean, some countries moved along, but the countries that were left furthest behind were actually the fragile and humanitarian settings. So any reflections, insight, and even on FIND's point of view, like how is the diagnostics agenda looking for those very unique settings and countries? Thank you.
I guess maybe I should take that one, at least first. So thanks. It's actually a very timely question. So just very recently, we have set up at FIND a humanitarian emergencies unit. This is not, we're not a response organization, so this is not putting people into the field during an emergency, but nevertheless recognizing that these are the most vulnerable, of course, in the system. And even if you didn't want to approach that for ethical reasons, strategically, there's reasons basically to try to make sure that we're administering to the people in those situations. I think there's been a lot of progress. What I've seen in my field over the years has been mostly working with viral hemorrhagic fevers. There's been a lot of progress in outbreak response in targeting the particular cause of that outbreak. Once we know that there's an Ebola outbreak or Marburg or things like that, still work to do, but nevertheless we're pretty good. And if you look at the statistics, how long's the time from the first case into when we actually diagnosed it and found out that's been shrinking. And so we've seen Ebola outbreaks, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the last few years where that's come down. They're pretty good at recognizing it and finding out. The much harder part is that, of course, all the other stuff still exists, right? The malaria is still there, and if you look at most outbreaks, and during the outbreak, the massive outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, there were more people who died probably of malaria during that time that died of Ebola. So how do we keep those systems still intact so the person who has TB or HIV or diabetes or hypertension, so they can still get care. So that's really from a FIND perspective, that's really what we want to promote. And then on a seemingly simple but I think equally important way, an example of that, you have an event that happens somewhere. Let's not talk about an infectious disease outbreak, but an earthquake or a war, and so you have 1 million refugees come across the border. They come, of course, with all their problems, right? And so two things that we need to address there. First of all, those populations are vulnerable to outbreaks of certain infectious diseases, measles and the like, and so we need to have surveillance systems put in place. And then, of course, again, they come across the border when they still have their diabetes or their hypertension and other things that need to be addressed. We've had some recent meetings with ICRC and MSF just last week and try to figure out how can we work with some of these, the true actors on the ground in these emergencies and to support them with diagnostic capacity. So in its infancy, but something that we recognize and something that's moving forward. We also have Sonia, I see there is an ongoing project looking at reinforcing diagnostic capacity or laboratory capacity. There you go, perfect. There you go. That's the project, basically looking at how to reinforce laboratory capacity in conflict settings. So pilot projects, one going on in Gaza and one going on in Goma in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So more to hear about in the future, but something that we are recognizing and starting to act on.
I'm so glad you highlighted that, because basically what I was going to say is partnerships and health organizations not just staying in health-only silos, but recognizing the need to work with disaster relief and humanitarian relief organizations, which clearly FIND is doing brilliantly already. And the other thing I was just going to say in terms of an opportunity for learning how to do this better in future is there are these conversations ongoing about a global medical countermeasures platform, and lots of people have different opinions about that and what its uses may or may not be, but I think one of the opportunities of that is if there is a more coordinated approach to collective medical countermeasure response, as well as having vertical pillars of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, having cross-cutting elements. And in conversations that I've been in, there is a recognition that there needs to be a specific cross-cutting theme in any platform like that would specifically look at the rollout of countermeasures in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And I think that's a real opportunity, and I think we should try and turn that into reality by using that to kind of codify some of these partnerships between disaster relief organizations who have the know-how of practically how to get things there with technical experts who know how to do the testing. Thanks.
So Sarah Jane's given me the 2-minute warning, and that was a minute ago, so I think we're down to the last minute. So last question, I guess, and I'd like to just get your thoughts on the challenge of universal health coverage. And so, we recognize that no matter how good our systems are, if you say this is a great system, but a person who's sick and doesn't actually have access to care, we can't give them the treatment we need. We can't know if they're the first case of SARS-CoV-3 or whatever it is. How do we advocate and make sure that stays really, as a priority? I think you'd agree it's a priority, but how do we do that?
Not just give me an easy one to end with, why don't you? So completely agree it's a critical priority, and hopeful moment in the future in September that there's this high-level meeting on universal health coverage at UNGA this year. But I think we really need to use that to break down what we mean by universal health coverage. I think sometimes UHC starts to get just thrown around as another acronym, and I know, having worked with government ministers, that sometimes just is this just more health jargon? And I think we need to break down what we really mean as the building blocks of universal health coverage, practically what it takes for a country to get to a good baseline of universal health coverage, and be really supporting countries to get there. But it does also need country ownership, because you can't just have WHO parachuting everything in and telling people what to do. It's about regional and national context. So it's about working alongside countries to develop that level, to have the domestic resource mobilization alongside the external support where it's needed to build the basic level of capacities. But I think it starts with a really clear understanding of what we mean in the most critical building blocks. I think workforce has to be an absolutely central element of that. And yeah, it's about maintaining the political will from every single country that it is a priority for them to prioritize. And even in countries like the UK, it's still difficult, having worked in local public health in the beginning of my career, advocating for some of the budget to get spent on public health in local authorities. It's still really challenging. Ministers want to spend money on things that are sexier and get them more immediate returns sometimes, and long-term systems building doesn't always seem sexy. So we have to really make the economic case to political leaders of why this is a critical building block for everyday health of your population that has huge economic benefits in terms of productivity, if you want to be really cold-hearted about it, but also has huge benefits in terms of making us ready for the next pandemic.
I want to thank you for being with us this morning. Thank you for all your work doing. I think a round of applause is certainly merited. So.
And I didn't fall off the stool.